Today we welcome Karl Butzer, Professor of Geography at University of Texas at Austin. He has an endowed professorship of liberal arts here. Karl is one of the few colleagues who can count as being both a physical geographer and a cultural geographer. His interests span geology to Neolithic archaeology. He is just as much at home in North America as in Europe. He has conducted research in the Mediterranean, in Africa, and particularly in Spain. But one of the interesting things is that he is equally interested in the conceptual and theoretical developments of the discipline, as he is a most careful and dedicated empirical researcher. You are a very complex person, Karl, and I'm fascinated that you came today and that we can discuss something of your background, what led you to such a catholicity of interests, and what you see as exciting to pursue in the future. But first, why don't you tell me something of your background, your childhood experiences, and what led you to geography?
Well, I suppose that one can start that off relatively early. My parents immigrated to England from Germany in the 1930s because my father was politically opposed to the regime in power at the time. And as a result, I grew up in the British and subsequently in the Canadian system, and went towards my bachelor's and master's degrees in McGill, and subsequently went back to Germany on a scholarship to work for the PhD at the University of Bonn. So in a sense, it's kind of a full circle of experiences and exposures to do two different culture worlds. And then subsequently I took my first university position in Wisconsin, and then Chicago, and finally here in Texas. So that the American experience is sort of a second level of, shall we say, living in the Anglophone world, and obviously I feel in most ways like a North American, but the old world ties are quite strong, and with that, of course, comes a perhaps a stronger vocation than most Americans might feel to working in the old world, and also being much more sensitive to the complexity of culture in the old world. That simply comes from realizing those many little differences and signals that people give when they belong to a particular dialect group or to particular town loyalty, whatever it might be, which are things that are rather unusual in terms of the United States.
But that childhood experience, how old were you when you moved from England to...
I was 2 or 3 at the time.
Yes. And growing up in Canada, were there any particular experiences that made you curious about geography?
Well, I always liked the great outdoors, and we had a country house in the mountains, and I spent 3 or 4 months a year there, and from that grew, I suppose, a kind of intuitive feeling for field work in physical geography. It was always something I was quite comfortable in, rather than a sort of experience that somebody really grew up in an urban world feeling somewhat out of place in the African savannah someplace 500 miles from the nearest town.
I see. Well, were there teachers? Were there certain books you read? Or was it merely the out of doors and the exploratory side?
Well, I suppose that being in a country house for much of the year, I also did a lot of reading, which I probably wouldn't have done if I had grown up in the city. And in my college years, I did a lot of reading in the summers that didn't relate at all to the mathematics that I was supposed to be majoring in college at the time, and that had a major impact on me. I read in the abridged edition of Toynbee's Study of History in second or third year college, and that absolutely fascinated me. And subsequently, in my last year of college, I stumbled by accident into a year's course in essentially kind of a world social geography that was taught by a really inspired young geographer from Oxford who was a physical geographer and who was being in a sense, placed in a position of teaching a course that was not in physical geography, and he tried in many ways to bridge two sides of the field. And with the interests I had, this appealed to me immensely. And after about 3 weeks, I told my parents, I said, this is where I go after I get that degree in honors math. I'll do it for your satisfaction, and you feel that I have career potential, which they never believed I would have in geography.
Isn't that amazing? Who was that teacher? What was his name?
His name was U. Thompson. He unfortunately died 2 or 3 years later of a heart attack while working on the Baffin ice sheet. And so it was one of those things where you never got disillusioned later by how he turned out, shall we say, and it always sort of remained as that sort of single point of inspiration. And at McGill in the first year in graduate school, subsequently, I worked with Ken Hare, who had a very liberal interpretation of what people do, and he just sort of, in a sense, encouraged me to do extensive reading on things that I liked. And I tried to search what there was in the geographical literature that related to, in effect, the kinds of cues that I received from Toynbee's book. And I was then, in a sense, encouraged to read the Ellsworth Huntington literature, which I did quite carefully. Then I read a variety of things dealing with climate and human physiology and other types of things of this ilk. And the possible lists, I had a translation of Fevre that I was given, and when I've been through it all, I said, somehow this isn't working.
No.
And so I began to work more in empirical things that crystallized out into a master's thesis on the Near East and climatic variation on the one hand and nomadic migrations on the other, as essentially a test of whether or not one could do something there. And it didn't work very well. The data in either category were really quite unsatisfactory. And when all was said and done, I was rather disillusioned about the quality of the empirical work that one generally found in publications. And when I went to Germany for the PhD, I fairly consciously, in fact, began to gather empirical data on my own, and opportunity of some field trips to Egypt and other areas at the time showed me it was very well possible in a short time to see and learn things in the field that you simply never would find in a textbook. Textbooks were really, in fact, quite useless in the field. I had gone through every available geomorphology book before I went to Egypt, and very little of what I saw in Egypt actually corresponded to what I read in the book. And from this, I began to realize that in the field you could generate data of your own that was a great deal more useful, and where you had a sense of not only the quality, but how far you could, in a sense, take it as something that was reliable, where the limitations were. And over a longer period of time from there on in, I then was able to continue on this trajectory that really was very different from what I had started off in at McGill. But that goes a bit further than the original question, but it's sort of a...
Yes, but there's something that puzzles me, though. What attracted you about this Thompson's lectures and Toynbee was the sort of macro hypothesis about things, the deductive approach, as it were. And yet you rebelled against it. You liked it on the one hand, your imagination was challenged by it, but when you began to work, you became very much inductive. You
That's
wanted
right,
the
yes.
data and build it. Would you say you're an inductive type, or?
No, I think that I really like to alternate the two approaches. And for a while I was fascinated by the bigger generalizing approach, and found that it was a fascinating arena to work. But eventually I realized that it wasn't possible to do this in a way that was really responsible, at least with the information that I had, and felt that I had to in a sense, immerse myself in the inductive type of work. And I did that for quite some time, and never lost an interest and concern with the first, but felt in the sense that this was part of a growing experience.
Yes.
And when I came back, it was consciously. I felt that the interest was there. In fact, I was shocked when it was while working on some moraines in northern Spain with one of my best graduate students in 1969, I think it was. We were talking quite casually, and he made the comment that I was known among the graduate students as the hyper-empiricist. And I was stunned, absolutely stunned, because I never thought of myself as an empiricist as such. And I realized that I had, in a sense, in class, always emphasized that it isn't that easy. You can't generalize that quickly on this, and so on. That this had, in a sense, been a kind of almost a preoccupation. And from there on in, I was conscious of this as a sense of in the sense of giving a wrong signal. And I then began to much more consciously work towards being at the same time constructive and seeing what one could cautiously devise by way of, shall we say, normative views on something, and to balance out my natural tendency to be perhaps hypercritical at times with a more constructive way of looking at things. And so I began to be much more concerned with developing models, should we say. But that was a real shock, and it, in a sense, told me that my classroom posture, at least, was not in conformity with the way I really thought.
Isn't that interesting? But at Bonn, preparing for your Doctor of Science degree there, what was the atmosphere like? Did it favor the model building, or did it favor the field empirical approach?
It was entirely empirical, and in a sense, I suppose that going in the direction I did was influenced by that. It was a laissez-faire atmosphere, by definition, in part because of the very large number of students that a professor had to advise, so that you got a chance to tail a conversation with your professor maybe once or twice a year if you were lucky. And you were otherwise very much on your own devices. And Karl W, who was essentially the department, was a field man. This was all that he really conveyed in his lectures, was this tremendous fascination with observation, and also at the same time synthesis drawn from actual observation. And the years were really quite influential, because I learned something about the necessity of going beyond description. Troll rarely gave anything that came from a secondary source. And he was always balancing out the presentation of detail on the one hand and drawing interpretations and synthesis on the other. And on some of the weekend field trips that we took, although I never took notes, and perhaps appeared very much like a casual observer in the back of the bus, I was in fact learning something that has been with me ever since, namely that you can actually read a landscape, not just as a physical or biotic world, but also the cultural world that you see, and that it is possible to analyze it analytically as you go along by pointing out physical attributes or traits or morphology, whatever, but at the same time that you in fact are reading out of it historical facts, cultural details and nuances and so on. And that, subliminally at least, stayed with me as being perhaps the highest state of the geographer's art. And I feel that I learned a great deal more from Karl W in that sense than I ever did from the types of materials that he presented in class, or the inspiration or feedback or whatever that he gave me in terms of my dissertation, which were reasonably good considering what other people got at the time, but really were not the type of contact that I like to provide the students that work with me.
That's interesting. He was one of the big names in landscape ecology as the ecological synthetic approach to landscape, and you have continued that. You do that with your own students too.
I suppose I do. I do it very differently. I felt while I was working on those things in Bonn, and I came rather close to at one point because I translated one of his papers into English. I wasn't 100% enthusiastic about the way he did things, but I would say that the broader mood of how he thought definitely had a major impact on me, but again, something that I only appreciated 5 and 10 years later.
Yes, one is rarely aware at the
Yeah.
time, yes. But now, with your Germanic background and your experience in the Anglo world, how come the fascination with the Mediterranean?
Well, that is very much an emotional thing. To work in an area with enthusiasm, I really have to be excited by it. And I'm not really excited by cloudy, humid, rather mundane landscapes. And this is the category that Transalpine Europe, or most of the United States, falls into for me. And in 1954, I took a trip to Spain, and I was on this rather old, rickety wooden carriage, crammed in with a lot of people, and at dawn, I looked out of the car and saw the pink glow of the sunrise on the wheat fields of northern Castile with a few puffs of cloud. And a few minutes later, the medieval walls of the city of Avila loomed up on the horizon, and that was an impression I just never forgot. And when I went to graduate school the subsequent year at McGill, every weekly colloquium was on measuring the depth of permafrost in some part of northern Canada or icebergs calving in Greenland. And I had that very strong conviction in me, I don't really care. And when I have a chance, I'm going south rather than north, and they can have the permafrost.
That's amazing. I think that it has happened for so many. The appeal is aesthetic and emotional.
Yes, very much so.
And often the contrast to one's normal life is what makes it attractive. But did the Mediterranean also allow you to pursue simultaneously your interests in the physical processes, physical landscape, and the human history? Was the Mediterranean a good arena for looking at this in an integrated way?
It was, but it didn't seem at first that I was in fact pursuing those types of goals. Most of the work I did in Spain, after the initial year or two that I worked in Mallorca, was in association with archaeological excavations. This was obviously an insight into culture, but it's a fairly arid form of culture that you get out of a Paleolithic excavation. What I did not realize, again, that part of the growing experience was understanding the workmen with whom we worked. We worked there 3 seasons with the essentially total labor force of 2 small hamlets. And I learned a tremendous amount, again, subconsciously, from seeing how these people interacted, the relationship of the mayor of a community that had 8 families to the other people there, the role that that mayor had with respect to roughly 20 workmen from a somewhat larger village, which was further away, the role of a village in another direction where this one village would have absolutely no social contact at all, so that in fact the workmen refused to use the mayor or allow the mayor to be the foreman, and eventually all left. And then finally the role of the parish priest, who serviced all of these communities and who had a rather strange relationship to them for various reasons. And he was brought into a conflict about how much payment had to be used to indemnify one owner of a field on which we had worked, and seeing the interaction of everybody sitting around talking for, in a sense, 2 days. There was tremendous commotion, and eventually an arrangement was reached with the priest trying to serve as an intermediary, but eventually I realized that what had seemed to be a major coup of our excavation director in bringing him in didn't work out quite that way, because he was not allowed to play the role that we thought he would play, and in fact the decision was made on a much more personal level. But seeing these interactions between those people and seeing how they thought and worked, and their insistence on personal quality control of what they did, their strong pride in their work, their relationships with each other, and this, what probably is the central part of the whole story, the effort of all of these people to get along, the sense of community, the avoiding of conflict. This was something that stayed with me in an incredibly vivid way, so that when I eventually became more and more explicitly involved in cultural features, phenomena, and became engaged in work in younger time ranges, it was unconsciously the experience with these people that always came back to me. This was a real world of interaction. It was a kind of a laboratory where I had grown up without realizing it was a laboratory. And the sum of all the things that I learned in Spain that dealt with contemporary Spain and traditional lifeways, and particularly agriculture and livestock and so on, actually came from these many years of working in contexts of Paleolithic and so on excavations. In the course I gave last year on historical geography of Spain, I finally packed out all my slides, and they were about 6,500 taken from Spain in those earlier years. And from that, I was able to put together an incredible cultural geography of settlement types, of traditional agriculture, herding, and so on, that I'd obviously been subconsciously paying attention to along the way, but had never really seen as part of something in the bigger scheme of things.
That was marvelous that you were open to learning something from the experience, instead of just being exasperated by the fact it wasn't operating like a German situation would operate. I mean, the social geography of the actual site gave you as much information about life
Ultimately,
as
yes.
the archaeology did. That was marvelous.
And in fact, I began at that time to interview people about things, did not in fact realize that I'd begun asking people about how they did things and why at that point, namely from the point of view of trying to understand the differences of soil quality, which was directly relevant to the work. But I, for the first time there, really was experimenting in terms of asking people about how a soil type is called, how it's distinguished, what the advantages and disadvantages are, and so on. And that sort of opened up that first door of what you get from asking people, as opposed to just sort of traveling by car and making inferences, which are often quite wrong.
It's kind of ethno-methodology,
Yes, it
without
was,
calling it that.
Yeah.
But I don't know where the archaeological element came in first for you. Was this during the Bonn years? Or?
Yes, it happened. There was a logic to it, because the dealing with nomadic migrations, which sort of started the whole thing off, brings you into culture history. When you then work with geomorphology for a longer period of time, the sense of extension of time into the Pleistocene is very easy. You then have to deal with the prehistoric record. So you read the prehistoric literature, you try to find out what the criteria are for attaching cultural designations to Nile terraces or whatever it might be, so you become involved. It then happened that on my second trip to Egypt, Karl Troll had just heard about a young Egyptologist that was going to work in Egypt on a survey, looking for very late prehistoric sites. And he suggested that I might want to get in touch with him to perhaps coordinate our work, because this might give me some good opportunities. So we spent a longer period than I care for walking up and down the sides of the Nile Valley. We walked, in effect, half of the stretch from Luxor to Cairo in the process, and we didn't get along very well at all. But the constant questions that he was raising gave me a very good idea about what people coming out of the humanities don't understand about the landscape, or the logic of why there are settlements here and not there, and what are strategies of where we should be concentrating our looking efforts, because there's a good probability of finding something there as opposed to someplace else. So from this I began to develop an explicit sense of strategies of, you might call it archaeological excavation or other survey, that come from criteria of landscape classification, and trying to integrate these two and find a logic as to why you would or would not expect a site here or on this particular stretch. So the interest in archaeological problems very concretely came together at that time, and I was, engaged in this type of thing for a long time because of the opportunities that this type of work offered in an era where the National Science Foundation had discovered the concept of interdisciplinary research.
Well, you recognized early what archaeology had to teach geography or human science, but you also brought a lot to archaeology by introducing archaeologists to this other dimension, the economic, the cultural, the social, which maybe there weren't, or the aerial, the landscape, which maybe hadn't been a practice in archaeology before you entered the field.
Shall we say, initially I certainly didn't offer anything in the cultural arena, because in a sense I was trying to develop a set of systematics of how to bring, shall we say, landscape criteria into a framework that could be used in archaeological research. And there was another stimulus to this, that when I went to Wisconsin, I was not allowed to teach a course in geomorphology. Geomorphology, under the title geomorphology, was a prerogative of the geology department, hence it was a hands-off issue. And at the same time, we had a gentleman in the department that taught landforms, so that was closed. But the suggestion was made that there is a course on the books called Introduction to Historical Geography. Mm-hmm. And maybe you could use that as an avenue to do something that would be a combination of your Pleistocene interests and prehistory and who knows whatever. And that is exactly what happened. I used that as a way to bring together prehistoric research with more standard quaternary studies, and to develop these in a systematic way that was not just alongside of each other, but also brought together points of interfingering. And in the course of that, I started systematically working out classification of, you might call it, geological sites, ways of providing a kind of normative framework of where to look and how to do it. And on the basis of that course, my environment archaeology as a book came together.
I wondered if it was out of that experience,
yeah,
because this is one of your most popular books, I think. It has circulated very widely, and it is acclaimed by archaeologists and by geographers, right?
Well, geographers subsequently did apparently find something of merit in it, but they didn't actually review it.
No. Well, that's a story of sociology of editorial politics. But environment and archaeology, this sort of summed up your landscape or your ecological approach to issues, archaeological issues, yes. And I noticed, I haven't read it all, but I've heard of it before, and what attracts me about it is that instead of just dealing in theory, scientific theory or methodology, you refer to specific regions. There are regional examples which help the reader pull things together. So is there something more you'd like to talk about with respect to this book? Why did it get a second printing if it weren't popular?
Let's put it this way. It filled a real need in archaeology at the time it appeared. There was great interest in these types of things. and it was exceptionally well reviewed in Science, a 3-page review by leading archaeologists at Berkeley. And this came in the department at Wisconsin at a very opportune time, because the word was just going around that I'd written this absolutely absurd book. And the interest clearly came for many years out of archaeology. This is where the sales were, and archaeology students were buying it, and it was being used in classrooms to provide a framework of what was in effect geography, remedial geography perhaps in some ways, for archaeologists, because it provided a synopsis of the physical environment, biotic environment per se. It provided an introduction to more specific environments that concerned time ranges and areas in the prehistoric record. It dealt with site studies that provided, in effect, the case study sort of information of how you can actually do it, what it tells you, what it doesn't tell you. And it sold very well, and the need for a second edition came from exactly that market. And the book was, and I was quite surprised about that, cited as the contribution that the geographers gave me the award for in 1968. I'm still not sure who was on that committee, but I was flattered that somebody had noticed it. And in the second edition, I tried then to, in effect, develop the cultural framework and also the matter of interrelationships between culture and environment much more explicitly than I had in the first. So the second edition has at least a good half on an analysis of the prehistoric record as you would see it as, in effect, I think, perhaps a cultural geographer, although the limitations of dealing with prehistory from the point of view of culture, of course, are immense. So that's how that book developed, and it provided me, shall we say, the type of appointments that allowed me the luxury of developing further. The problem ultimately is that people who are between the fences are often, shall we say, more often than not, penalized for what they do. This particular book saved me the embarrassment that would have come from being somebody that did not conform to the orthodoxy of either field that he was in. And as a result, I was allowed to go further than this and to grow with time and complete, the sort of larger development of cultural interrelationships that I was really interested in, because that is something that doesn't come overnight.
Field of cultural ecology, you call it now, yes. But it's ironic almost, the timing of this award from the Association of American Geographers. I think it was at the same meeting that great revolutions were being spoken of, and the big issue was positivism versus anti-positivism and social revolution. And here you come with a book about prehistoric man and arguments for an ecological approach to the field at a time when only spatial analysis counted, if I remember correctly.
Oh, yes.
So did you ever worry about being a little bit misfit in the trends of geography?
Not really, because in 1966 I went to Chicago, and the initiative for the appointment came from the anthropology department. And it was a joint appointment in anthropology and geography. In fact, the first several years there, I didn't even have an office in the geography building. And I really wasn't particularly concerned as a result that I was quite obviously out of sync with what was happening in geography at the time. There's a great deal in this book, obviously, that is implicitly normative. Mm-hmm. But I simply had no interest in developing statements about how these things should work that would have given the impression that it was intentionally positivistic. And I didn't expect that the types of people that basically dominated the field of geography at that time would be interested, and it took quite some time, in fact, before I began to integrate myself into the geography department in Chicago, which I did in the Meixel years, because at that point they was a great deal more interested in what I was doing than there had been when I came. When I arrived at Chicago for my interview in geography, the chairman at that time asked me, a few polite questions, and he said, "Karl, we're not really interested a bit in what you do, but the anthropologists want to have you, and we have no reason to object." So I was willing to take that at face value.
That's fine. So you stayed at Chicago from 1966 until
84.
84. So they were your main years of full-time research in this particular area.
Yeah.
Yes. And then you came to Texas. Yes. Did Texas in some way symbolize a return to the South, to the sun, to proximity to Spanish speaking, etc.?
Yes, very much so. I had visited Austin many times over the years, because one of the people that left Wisconsin in those years when a lot of people from Wisconsin were scattering to the winds. And I was really very much impressed by the physical environment here. At the time, it struck me more as being similar with East Africa than with the Mediterranean world, because I had, in fact, been out in the areas a little further from the edge of town than where we subsequently lived. And I found it very romantic, and very often the light and then the sort of development of the weather in the course of the day, particularly in the summer months, is very similar to the way it is in East Africa. And that appealed to me. The interest that I was following more explicitly in historical cultural geography in Spain then provided a new attraction because of the proximity to the Spanish colonial world. It still has a very impressive cultural imprint in Texas. And it seemed that I would be almost next door to something that was certainly very close to my heart. I hadn't quite conceived of the border of Mexico as being a potential study area, which it has become. But it certainly appealed to me, and it seemed to be kind of a compromise that I never really was going to be able to afford a summer house in Spain, but I might be able to live somewhere here in Austin that would look a lot like it, and we were quite lucky.
You found one. That's
Yes.
wonderful. That's really wonderful. Now, before we go further into your future plans, I'm sure you have many future plans for research along these lines. I do want to return to the question of how you integrate these diverse interests. I mean, you are a specialist in the archaeological, geological, climatological, and cultural ecological aspects of landscape, and recognized as such. You have medals from Geological Society, Archaeological Society, as well as you're now a member of the Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. What's the secret? How can you integrate such a wide variety of fields? Are they separate worlds in you, or have you brought them together through some central curiosity that transcends all of them?
There is a central curiosity that does transcend all of them, very much so, and I personally see no real conflict between them, although I do at this point see work that is strictly geomorphological as being increasingly tedious. But bringing them together actually is something that did take a tremendous amount of time. I was interested in the things that I do now, specifically in the last 3 or 4 years. At the time I was in my undergraduate and graduate training, this is what really was perhaps the strongest motivation for being in geography at all. However, at the time I just wasn't ready for it. I didn't have the training, I didn't have the experience. And the idea of trying to bridge the social sciences and the natural sciences was almost inconceivable in the 1950s. A great deal has happened since that in terms of introducing systems theory, the idea of modeling, the ways in which ecology can be used that transcend the narrow use of ecology in the biological sciences. These were things that were not part of one's repertoire of thought organization. And it was very difficult for geographers in particular to cope with the duality of cultural human interests on the one hand and their traditional interests in the physical and biotic environment on the other. Very difficult thing to integrate. And so in a sense, I started off with the interest in the one area, then found myself drifting into the other for the reasons I've sort of outlined. And in the process, I became a physical geographer, not because I had any great conviction that I wanted to become one, but I became one because, in effect, I was learning my professional craft. And after having acquired the necessary experience there over 10 and 15 years, depending on how you want to define it, I then gradually began to work my way back into the much more explicit coping with cultural concerns that my increasing sophistication was allowing me to do. And so as I make that last 10 years of transition into what I'm now working on, I'm following, in fact, a fairly conscious strategy that has been with me for a long time, but which simply could not be implemented overnight. So I would say that doing this type of thing is something that cannot be done immediately. You have to acquire the expertise and professionalism in the natural science part of the field, which is something that cannot be done easily. And this is one of the major problems that archaeologists have in trying to implement some of these working methods in their field, because in a sense they hope that by taking a course or two, they've mastered the ecological approach to archaeology, and of course it doesn't work that way. Even taking 3, 4, 5 courses doesn't do it. It's something that really has to be worked at over a very long period of time. And similarly, to deal with culture is not something that you can learn in a short time either. It's not a matter of counting fence posts. It's something where you have to come to grips with the complexity of how people are. And I was, for a very long time in my life, really absolutely mystified what made people tick. And overcoming that as a barrier to dealing with them, and then beginning to, in fact, enjoy the complexity of people and their reactions as both individuals and as communities, working, in other words, as aggregates. They try something else than what they are, in fact, doing as individuals, and learning, in a sense, the different levels of what a particular statement, an action or an actual verbal statement means, depending on when you hear it and how it's being said, and reading between the lines. These are things that, you don't pick up in a day. It takes, again, years and years. And so I feel comfortable now that I've learned enough over roughly 25 years to be able to do both things equally well and to, in a sense, see how the two come together. But it's something that you cannot train a student at the level of the PhD to do. It doesn't work.
Nor can you really encapsulate it in a formula such as it's all ecology, or that it's all system. I've heard you speak on the methodological level, on the conceptual level, and on the substantive curiosity level as potential ways that you integrate or that you can bring these things together. I still don't know what the burning curiosity is that makes it worthwhile. You've talked about, I love to know how it makes people tick. That covers a multitude. But you focus on history, on the past, rather than the present. I would think, given your empirical penchant for observations and good data and so on, that you would find present-day landscapes more easy to handle in this integrated way. But no, instead you choose to remain with the archaeological or the historical.
No, that's quite true, and it reflects something that is more than just an accident of the way that I have worked or found opportunities for doing field research. It's a deep-seated conviction that I have that if you study a synchronic situation, in other words, a totally contemporary world, whatever scale, you are faced with what is essentially the details of system maintenance. Mm-hmm. You're seeing relatively short-term types of minor adjustments. You see very little that gives you a sense of how fundamental change works. And to be able to understand the deeper-seated processes, I feel very, very strongly, you have to work historically. And these are the things I'm much more interested in. I'm obviously concerned with modern world problems, issues of long-term population growth, the question of development in the third world, the issues of degradation of the environment, and so on. All these issues pose. And I have taught a number of courses, from one on applied geomorphology to variants of my cultural ecology course that deal with contemporary issues. I've gone through the process of really confronting these issues to the point that they became a rather traumatic emotional experience. And I conveyed that in class. But I in fact find that it is difficult to convey that same sense of outrage repeatedly year after year in the course, or even after 2 or 3 years. And to me, the issues really are understanding and finding from different levels of understanding something about the range of potentials of what might in fact happen that are not necessarily part of a sort of a gloomy prediction, cause and effect type of issue. And what I get out of my work is that the decisions that people make are very often totally out of the realm of what you would have expected. In our case studies that we've done in eastern Spain, the entire region is part of a broader phenomenon in Spain at that time. In the second half of the 19th century, was faced with an expanding population at a time of very finite resources. And what did the people do to cope with that particular predicament? And they tried so many different things, and as we've been able to, through interviews with the oldest people in our village, find out more about the actual decisions that were being made just about at the beginning of the present century. In other words, the time depth of memory of the oldest individuals goes back to events that they can certainly at second hand still convey. And what we find is that at the level of decision making, that still within the realm of oral tradition, one strategy after another was being tried to cope. They began in the 1890s to grow grapes on what had been the old goat pastures and sheep pastures, because at that time the French wine industry had been wiped out by the phylloxera. And for about 20 years, they were able to make a tremendous amount of money by converting pasture into vineyards until the same disease gradually moved down and hit the vineyards in Spain. At that point, they were wiped out. And then they, in a sense, held town council meetings where they discussed what the options were. And they had two different options. One was to go back into grazing activities, but this time on a larger scale. They were going to buy up the lands from the surrounding municipalities and run their herds all over the place. And the alternative possibility was to plant cork oak, because they had heard about the commercial value of cork and the area was ecologically suited for it. But Corco needed a 10 to 12 year startup period. They decided on the Corco because it had better potential. And they invested in that for 30 years. Eventually it bombed because of a variety of corporate bankruptcies of the companies they were dealing with, and then the Civil War came in, and at that point they had run out of their potential options. And at that point only did they make that decision that they'd always been trying to avoid, namely there was nothing better to do than to go to the big cities and work in industry, but to maintain the close ties with a village so that in a sense everybody that works in a city, whether it's in Valencia or in Barcelona, will try his best at least to come back for a summer vacation, and if at all possible even for every weekend, and they will still work in the fields for a few hours to maintain their ties with their roots. So in a sense they were going through a series of alternative possibilities. They were discussing them, they were arguing about them, they were always choosing the one that was closest to their own cultural predilections. They saw things in a short versus a long-term strategy. They made decisions in favor of long-term remedial action. And behind this then is the unspoken problem of actual birth control, and they had been in fact coping with that for some time already, because we can see in the statistics that the population, depending on the village, is leveling off anywhere between 1850 and 1910. And then suddenly starts to go down. And this is before, in fact, the records show that people have begun to emigrate to the cities. So despite the fact that they are devout Catholics, that they are conservative, traditional, small rural villages in the so-called backwaters, here we find people quietly making decisions in terms of the number of children that they can possibly have under the circumstances, making rational decisions as to how the villages will cope with shortage of resources, how they maintain a very open view towards information from the cities of what the options really are, working with those options in mind, and finally finding a kind of a compromise solution whereby they live in the city but still have not given up the roots, and where those family members that stay in the village in fact are able to, in fact are almost commissioned to hold on to the land at all costs. Land is not to be sold. It has to be kept, even if it's not worked. And if they can't pay for the taxes, the man in the city will pay for the taxes for some relative, so that the name of the family remains attached to those particular plots of land that they have had since whoever knows when. So those are things that you begin to appreciate are part and parcel of understanding what will happen in terms of the 30-year future or the 50-year future. You can't just look at the UN statistics and say that the birth rate has been going so and so, the carryover in terms of demography tells us we're going to have a such and such high population level. This will mean so and so for the pressure on resources. It will mean that for environmental degradation, and we will have this and this kind of a disaster. When the population peaked in our little Sierra communities in the period around 1880, nobody could ever have predicted what happened. They coped reasonably well. They have maintained an integrity of community even while living outside. They have found a solution that is still within the framework of what is culturally acceptable. And they have done so in a way that has been reasonably conscious and deliberate, and they have tested options and alternatives, and they have found a way between them in sequence. And this is something that I think that has a great deal of bearing on in a sense, evaluating a problem in a third world country. One can't simply assume that these are big trends that you can look at as statistical aggregates and that will lead inevitably to a certain set of outcomes, because in a sense those people are just as rational, as discursive and interactive in their community settings as our people were too.
So you obviously are very convinced of a sort of idealist interpretation of history, that is conscious human subjects coping, making decisions, choosing, and so on. Do you reject the kind of structuralist way of telling the story, that it's economics and material realities that really dictate the course of history? I'm afraid we've run out of time. This is enough for another tape, I'd say. Okay, sorry. 5 minutes. Oh. 5 minutes, we finished. What is your most important future plan, research-wise?
Well, to you know, come back to the initial question there, I believe those are big frameworks. Those are the essentially mega frameworks that allow you to interpret larger trends for larger regions and aggregates of communities or cities, whatever it might be, in terms of providing a broader framework for discussion, interpretation, formulation of problems, and so on. In that sense, they're very useful. But I think that at the point where you begin to deal with the realities, you have to come to grips with something much more manageable, and you have to deal with something that is closer to the ground. And whether this is done in terms of an archival investigation or an archival plus archaeological type investigation, as we've tried for the medieval period, or whether you try it from some of those sort of mixed interview and historical kinds of approaches we've used for the last 150 years, you do have to come to grips with the mechanics of how things have worked at the microscale and what have been the basic motivations. What have been the value systems that have been most sacrosanct in terms of when hard decisions have had to be made. At that level, you simply go out of the realm of certain kinds of useful theoretical frameworks, and it is a different type of experience that has to be seen for its own sake, and in a sense, on the basis of several good case studies, it is possible to develop a rather different interpretation of, shall we say, a macroeconomic interpretation of the, quotes, 19th century in Spain or something of the sort. So the two have merit, it's just that in a sense they do illuminate different types of things, and they shed light on complementary issues that you may want to confront.
And what is your most exciting new research frontier in a couple of minutes?
Well, basically, I am concerned now to take the experience that we've gained in Spain to dealing with relationships between Mexico, in terms of its colonial past, and Spain. And seeing Mexico as a place where many things have been found or are present or waiting to be discovered in the landscape that derive from Iberian roots. And in seeing these, recognizing them, and trying to understand them, I am now asking very different questions in Spain, at a macro level as opposed to a micro level often. And I find that this going back and forth now between Spain and Mexico is becoming a very fascinating arena of trying to implement a kind of cultural ecology that is, I suppose, comparative.
That's a wonderful horizon toward which to face. You've given us a tremendous insight into a very complex and interesting life experience. And what is most challenging, I think, is the way you persist in learning something new from each of these experiences. Thank you very much, Karl, for coming today.